So in times like this, I think it's really important for us to sometimes take the time out to examine our finances. And I'm not talking about the boring budgeting stuff. I'm talking about the stuff that really, really matters. The ability to have a pot of money or something set aside to ensure that we can fall upon it should the worst happen. And I think COVID has certainly highlighted the necessity of things like emergency funds as we've been through hell coming out of this, and there's news that we're going to be going back into localized lockdowns now. It has been a tough time for many people. And in this video, I want to talk about how to save an emergency fund and pay off debt at the same time. I'm going to walk you through 4 approaches. I'm going to explain the rationale behind them. I'm also going to give you the pros and the cons of each of them as well. And just so you've got something to take away to reflect upon, you will be able to download this beautiful looking PDF in the description below. So make sure you grab it. And if you are new to this channel, welcome. And make sure that you smash the like button, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you get notified when I upload videos just like this every Tuesday and every Friday, now at 5 p.m. So a couple of weeks ago, I did a video where I kind of showed you guys me utilizing my emergency fund because I had to fix some things on the car. And it came in really, really handy for me because if I didn't have the emergency fund, it would have gone onto a credit card. I would take on debt, probably pay a load of interest. And that wasn't something that I was willing to do. So I'm prepared as much as I possibly can. And I took you on that journey just to highlight how important it is. And I kind of lifted the lid on some of my personal finances in terms of what I've got going out on a monthly basis as well. This video is going to be a continuation of that, and it's come about because I did a live on IG on an account on Saturday, and we were talking about emergency funds, and a question came in and it said, well, how do you pay or save an emergency fund and pay debt at the same time, particularly if you've got an overdraft that you're always in? And I remembered that I wrote a guide that you guys are going to be privy to after this video. And I thought this would form a really good video for this week, especially on Sunday being asked for more financial management stuff on the live Q&A. So let's get into some of the approaches. But before we do that, I think it's really important we kind of ascertain an emergency fund. I know you know this already, but if you don't, this will be useful. So an emergency fund is essentially a pot of money that you can fall back upon if the worst were to happen. Furlough is a prime example of that. So in circumstances where you're taking a pay cut, reduction to your income, or you're simply unable to work, maybe due to sickness, maybe due to an accident, or maybe just due to the fact that you've lost your job. An emergency fund is there to kind of step in, keep the lights on, pay the mortgage, keep food in your tummy as well. So really, really important. Now, it's really important as well to note that with an emergency fund, you kind of get to decide how much you have. There are some numbers that are guidelines that are useful to use. I certainly use it in my own personal circumstances as a guideline to what I would like to have, so I've got a little bit of peace. But ultimately, the decision is down to you. So whether that be 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, the general rule of thumb is you need anywhere between 3 and 9 months. I know some people who like to have 12 months, but again, it's down to preference. Wherever you are, whatever you feel be comfortable with, that's the amount of an emergency fund that you should actually go for. Now, before we get into the rationale and the approaches that I'm going to share with you today, I think it's really important for us to kind of identify 2 kinds of emergency funds. Because oftentimes when you talk about emergency fund, you talk about the numbers and you say, well, it's your expenses, your committed expenses every single month times 3, 6, or 9. That becomes a really big number for people. And people are like, whoa, I'm never going to be able to do that. So I think it makes sense to break things down into smaller pieces. And this is where the concept of a short-term and a long-term emergency fund comes in, because it allows you to at least have a stepping stone towards the bigger long-term emergency fund. The best way to come up with your emergency fund number is essentially to add up all of your committed expenses. So things that you have to pay for. They will include rent, mortgage, car finance, credit cards, council tax, gas, electric. Things like Netflix, Spotify, Amazon will not be included because you can cancel those at any time. These are things that you have to pay because you are contractually obliged to pay them. Or if you didn't pay them, you just couldn't live. So things that you have to pay for that are necessities to you. You take that number, you times that number by 3, 6, or 9. Now, a short-term emergency fund is essentially a fund that is there to help you for one-off occurrences. So this might be changing tires on the car fails the MOT. These will be the kind of things that maybe only happen once a year or once in a blue moon. So it's a smaller amount of money to help you specifically with things like that. Now, with a long-term emergency fund, a long-term is looking towards the long term. So it is there to cover you if you were to take a pay cut or take a pay reduction of some kind for a prolonged period of time, you are unable to work for a prolonged period of time, is there to cover you for the longer periods, 6, 9 months, maybe even a year. Again, you get to decide, but the guidelines generally are that you need between 6 and 9 months. So with that being said, what are the 4 approaches that you can adopt or consider to adopt if you want to save an emergency fund and pay off debt at the same time? So the first approach you can adopt is to focus on building a short-term emergency fund first. Now, what this basically will do is help you break the cycle of getting into debt. And we all know that cycle. That cycle is something happens, we haven't got the money to deal with it straight away. So therefore it goes on to a credit card or it goes onto an overdraft. And by the time we got round to paying that off, lo and behold, something else comes up and then we're back on the credit cards, back on the overdraft. This approach will allow you to funnel some money into some savings so that you can break that cycle. And that may just be a case of you putting, say, £20 or £50 a month on a monthly basis to know that you end up over 6 months having put 50 quid away with £300 that you can then call upon if something else were to go wrong. Now, clearly with that, if you've got credit cards, you still have to continue making your minimum payments. So make sure you don't ignore that factor and adopt literally all of your money into an emergency fund on a monthly basis to give yourself a cushion. You still have to meet your credit obligations. So continue to pay your minimum payment on credit card. So there are some advantages and disadvantages to using this approach. We're going to talk about the advantages first. Now, the first thing that you're going to notice is that it's going to give you an emotional uplift in knowing that you're doing something that's going to help you break that debt cycle. That psychological boost is also going to help you form really, really good habits. It's going to give you the impetus to make sure you get into the habit of doing this on a monthly basis. So I would say, look, ride the wave. Really, really enjoy it. Take time to enjoy it as well. Because oftentimes people focus too much on debt in a negative fashion. And I know I've been there. It can be really demoralizing. It can be really, really depressing. And for a lot of people, it can be very, very overwhelming. So when you adopt this, bask in the enjoyment of having that emotional uplift in knowing that you're doing something to get yourself out of that cycle. The second advantage to this is also going to help you break that cycle of adding more debt on. So imagine, you've got £50 saved up every month for 6 months. That's £300. If anything were to happen, you've got £300 that you can call upon. You won't necessarily have to use that credit card or that overdraft again. So you're going to get that benefit as well that is going to help you break that cycle. And again, ride the wave of that emotional uplift that you're going to get with it as well. The last advantage that you get with this is that you actually get to focus on one thing. And I've kind of alluded to the fact that people focus on debt in a negative fashion. This will give you something positive to focus on. So this approach for the short-term emergency fund can be very, very impactful. But again, you need to have a plan to just make sure you have a plan in terms of, number one, being able to afford it, and also being able to make sure that it is sustainable as well. Now, there are a couple of disadvantages to this. The first one is that clearly you're not paying down the debt. So there's, you're holding it for a little bit longer. You're not clearing that debt as quickly as you may have liked because you're funneling a little bit of money into an emergency fund. And the side effect of that is you're going to accrue interest. So my piece of advice to you would be that, if you are considering this approach or you think it might work for you, sit down with your credit card, for example, and find out exactly how much you're paying in interest so that you can do almost a rough calculation of, right, how much interest am I likely to accrue if I don't pay off, say, £50 this month or for the next 6 months, and see how that offsets against actually having that pot of money set aside to help you break that cycle. It may work for people, it may not work for everybody, but it is an approach that you can consider that will add value, that will give you that peace of mind. The second approach you can take is to do a balanced approach while still building a short term emergency fund, but also paying off debt. So, what does that look like? That looks like, for example, you have £100 left over every single month, and you say, right, I'm going to pay £50 onto my credit card, £50 is going to go into my emergency fund. You could do it a 70-30 split, a 60-40 split. It doesn't really matter, but it allows you to basically approach both of the things at the same time. So you've got a dual focus. Now, there is one thing that is really important to note with this approach, and that is that when you are setting out doing this, or even approach number one, where you're building a short term emergency fund, it's really important to set a target of what you want your short term emergency fund to be. So if it is £300 and you're contributing £50 per month into an account to help you meet that £300, then you know you've got 6 months. Once you've hit that target, you can then go back to putting the full £100 back into the credit card, so you start to pay off that debt. But what that basically means is that you spent 6 months getting yourself a cushion, and then you can focus on paying down debt again. So what are the advantages of this approach? Well, you're going to get that emotional uplift, that psychological lift in knowing that you're doing something to break your debt cycle. You're also going to be focusing your attention on two things at once. So your focus, laser focus on building an emergency fund, but still paying down your debt. And that in turn is going to help you not just break the debt cycle, but also get you into a savings habit that will pay massive dividends when you come to the end of your debt as well. Just being able to get into that fashion of paying money into an account every single month becomes like clockwork after a while, and you become used to it. And it's very, very nice just to look at an account knowing that you've got some money there. So the disadvantage to this approach is the good old interest rate. So if you are, again, paying a credit card and it's relatively high in the interest rate, you have to acknowledge that where you're putting your emergency fund in a savings account is probably getting you very, very little. So in other words, you're not able to offset your interest on debt by your interest in savings, because bank rates, interest rates are so low. It is a trade-off, but it may be one that is worthwhile you considering. So again, just like in approach one, it's really important to sit down with your credit card to find out exactly what you're paying in terms of interest and tailor your approach accordingly. So the third approach you could take is a balanced approach to building a long-term emergency fund while still paying down debt. So it's very, very similar to the second approach. However, with this one, you're focusing on a long-term emergency fund. And again, it's really important for you to understand what your long-term emergency fund is. So are you looking at having 6 months, 7 months? You need to know what that number is. Now, remember what I said. Your short-term emergency fund is a stepping stone to your long-term emergency fund. So you having the short-term emergency fund in place will give you the confidence in knowing that you can go forward and continue to save and get into that habit, because you've already cultivated that habit. And this is really, really important because the psychology and the mindset becomes crucial at this stage. But this approach is essentially going to, again, allow you to tackle two things at the same time. And again, it's really important you have a credit card, you continue to meet your credit commitments, but you're taking a strategic view in terms of still paying down your debt, but also building some additional money on the side as a long-term piece to help you should the worst happen. God forbid we go back into localized lockdowns and I have to go shielding again, for example. So really, really important. There are a couple of advantages, very much like the first two. You're going to be making progress on two fronts. You're building a long-term one. You've already achieved the goal of building a short-term one if you've followed this all the way through, but now you're moving on to your long-term emergency fund and you're still paying down debt. You're still going to have that feel-good feeling in knowing I've killed the short-term emergency fund. I'm now working towards the big long-term emergency fund. that confidence that you'll get is going to be invaluable in your journey overall from a financial point of view. There are also some cons with this. So interest rates, again, are going to be a problem, particularly when you start to build large amounts of money into a long-term emergency fund. I mean, my emergency fund at the moment is probably around about £9,000 to £10,000. In a cash ISA, that isn't getting me anything. If I did have debt, I would certainly be paying more interest in debt than I would be having that money sat in a cash ISA. Unfortunately, there isn't much we can do about that these days. It is just the way the world is, which leads me to state this very, very obvious thing. For goodness sake, guys, please don't go and invest your emergency fund in the stock market. Please, please, please don't do that. It is the worst thing you could possibly do. Your emergency fund needs to be liquid, it needs to be fluid, it needs to be easily accessible. So something like a cash ISA is the perfect place for you to park it. The fourth and final approach that you could take is not to actually look at an emergency fund at all. And that is simply to focus all your energies on paying down the debt. Now, this is a little bit counterintuitive around how to save an emergency fund and pay off debt at the same time. But for some people, this is a decision that they come to because they can't fathom the idea of putting money away and paying high rates of interest on things like credit cards. If you are that way of thinking, then it means that you need to be aggressive, extremely aggressive in terms of your debt pay down. So it's funneling as much of your money as you possibly can into paying off your debt within a targeted time frame. This is really important, guys. Just don't funnel money into it and not have a goal or a timeline in mind. It's really important that if you're going to adopt this approach, that you say, right, I'm going to try and get this done in 6 months, in 9 months' time, and let it be done with. And you have to be really, really disciplined in the fact that if you are using, paying off a credit card, for example, you have to make sure that you're not carrying that credit card around with you and giving yourself the temptation to go and use it again. I know what it's like. I've been there. I have certainly done that more times than I would like to admit, even though I'd been in the industry for probably about 5 to 8 years at that point. But it's really important, guys, that you need to have a plan if you adopt this approach. Now, what are the advantages for taking this approach? One of the clear advantages of using this approach is the speed at which you pay down this debt. Hopefully, if things go well, you're paying down this debt so quickly that there won't be enough time for you to utilize or something else to happen for you to utilize that debt vehicle again. So the speed at which you're paying it down is really, really important. For some people who have money in the bank, who have savings in the bank, you may then actually consider that actually, you know what, you don't want it sat in a savings account, not really doing much. You may want to go and allocate that to the debt and save yourself a load of money. That is something that I have done just this year as a result of COVID. I had to pay off my car because it was a lot. And I need the car for work, especially being self-employed now. And it made sense to pay off that debt so I don't have the monthly liability that basically causes or did cause every single month. So it's put me in a better place personally because now I know that I'm going to find £862.34 every single month to pay for my car. So for many people in this situation wanting to look at this approach specifically, consider what cash you have lying around that you could use to utilize. And yes, it might be really painful to say goodbye to a lump sum of cash, and it was for me, definitely was for me. But the monthly reward that you're going to get in knowing that you haven't got to account for that particular debt is going to be just... The big disadvantage here is very, very clear. If whilst you're paying off this debt and you're aggressively doing so, if something else happens, then you're not going to have an emergency fund. You do run the danger of using it again. But, this is swings and roundabouts, guys. This is all about finding the approach that is going to work for you. Many people that I know will go through the balanced approach, do 50-50, and at least try and get a little bit of a balance that way. The approach that you choose is completely down to you. And this downloadable is going to be available for you to get in the description. So make sure that you do download it and let me know what you think. But guys, I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you so much for watching. This is a new routine for me, posting every Tuesday and Friday and looking at the analytics, and we just need to make sure that we get as many views as possible over the period of time as I attempt to grow the channel. So guys, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching this. If you haven't caught the podcast, it's right there. Go check it out. Until Friday, chat soon.